In the flickering candlelight of a medieval castle, a young bride trembles as she's escorted to her wedding chamber. But this isn't the romantic scene you might imagine from fairy tales. This is medieval Europe, where marriage was rarely about love, and wedding nights were often shadowed by fear, violence, and absolute powerlessness. Tonight, we're peeling back the layers of one of history's most persistent and disturbing legends, the infamous Jus Primae Noctis, or First Night Rites. But more importantly, we're exposing the very real horrors that medieval women faced on what should have been one of the most important nights of their lives. The legend is as chilling as it is famous. Feudal lords supposedly held the legal right to sleep with any newly married woman in their domain on her wedding night. The Latin term Jus Primae Noctis, literally meaning rite of the first night, has haunted our collective imagination for centuries. Popular culture, from Braveheart to countless novels, has painted vivid pictures of this medieval nightmare. But here's where our story takes its first dark turn into historical reality. The evidence for this practice? Almost non-existent. Modern historians have spent decades searching through medieval legal documents, church records, and contemporary accounts. What they've found is troubling in a different way. There is virtually no credible historical evidence that Jus Primae Noctis was ever a widespread, legally sanctioned practice in medieval Europe. The only significant medieval legal document to mention anything resembling this practice is Article 9 of Ferdinand II of Aragon's Sentencia Arbitral de Guadalupe in 1486. But here's the crucial detail. This document actually forbids lords from sleeping with peasant brides. It doesn't establish the right. It explicitly prohibits it. So if this legendary horror wasn't real, why does it persist in our historical consciousness? The answer reveals something even more disturbing about how we remember medieval women's suffering. The legend of Jus Primae Noctis served a purpose, but not the one you might think. Renaissance writers and later historians often use this myth to demonstrate how civilized and enlightened they had become compared to their medieval predecessors. It was historical propaganda, designed to make later periods seem more progressive by comparison. This is particularly sinister because it allowed people to focus on a largely fictional horror while ignoring the very real systematic oppression that medieval women endured every single day. The myth became a distraction from genuine historical trauma. But the absence of legalized first-night rites doesn't mean medieval wedding nights were safe or consensual. In fact, the reality was often far more complex and equally terrifying than any legend. To understand the true darkness of medieval wedding nights, we need to understand what marriage meant in medieval society. It wasn't a union of two consenting adults in love. It was a business transaction, a transfer of property, and a consolidation of power. Women in medieval Europe were not considered independent legal entities. From birth to death, they existed under the legal authority of men, first their fathers, then their husbands. When a woman married, she didn't just change her name, she literally became her husband's property, along with any land, money, or possessions she might have inherited. The wedding ceremony itself was designed to emphasize this transfer. The bride was often given away by her father to her new husband, symbolizing the literal handover of ownership. The ring wasn't just a symbol of love, it was a mark of possession, a visible sign that this woman now belonged to someone else. For many brides, their wedding night was the first time they would be alone with a man who now had absolute legal authority over their bodies, their futures, and their very lives. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of medieval marriage customs was how young many brides were, and how little choice they had in their fate. While the Catholic Church officially set the minimum age of consent at 12 for girls and 14 for boys, in practice, political and economic marriages were often arranged when children were much younger, sometimes as infants. These weren't just betrothals to be fulfilled later. Actual marriages occurred between children and much older adults. A girl of 12 or 13 might find herself married to a man in his 30s, 40s, or even older. On her wedding night, she would be expected to fulfill what medieval society considered her wifely duties, regardless of her fear, her physical immaturity, or her complete lack of understanding about what was happening to her. The concept of marital rape simply didn't exist in medieval legal or moral frameworks. A husband's right to his wife's body was considered absolute and divinely ordained. The church taught that women should submit to their husbands in all things, and this submission was expected to begin immediately after the wedding ceremony. Historical records from the period are filled with accounts of young brides who died in childbirth within months of their weddings, their bodies simply too young to handle pregnancy and delivery. But these tragedies were seen as God's will, not as preventable deaths caused by a system that treated children as commodities. The actual rituals surrounding medieval wedding nights were designed to emphasize the bride's loss of autonomy and the groom's acquisition of rights over her body. These weren't romantic traditions. They were public demonstrations of ownership and control. In many regions, the wedding party would escort the bride and groom to their bedchamber, sometimes staying to ensure that the marriage was properly consummated. The bride would be undressed by other women, often older relatives or servants, while ribald jokes and crude encouragement filled the air. This wasn't celebration, it was humiliation disguised as tradition. The bedding ceremony involved literally putting the couple to bed while witnesses watched and offered commentary. In some cases, the blood-stained sheets would be displayed the next morning as proof of the bride's virginity and the marriage's consummation. Imagine the terror of a young girl, knowing that her most private and potentially traumatic moment would become public knowledge. For many brides, this night represented not the beginning of a loving partnership, but the end of any personal autonomy they might have enjoyed as unmarried daughters. They were crossing a threshold from which there was no return, entering a legal and social state where they would have fewer rights than their husband's livestock. While we can't document widespread first-night rights, medieval legal records are full of evidence about what actually happened in marriage beds. Wife-beating was not only legal, but encouraged in many medieval legal codes. The phrase rule of thumb allegedly comes from the idea that a man could beat his wife with a stick no thicker than his thumb. Though this etymology is disputed, the sentiment it represents was very real. Medieval legal texts often discussed when and how a husband could correct his wife through physical violence. Church doctrine supported this, teaching that God had placed women under male authority specifically because of their supposed moral and intellectual weakness. A husband who failed to control his wife through force, if necessary, was seen as shirking his divinely appointed responsibility. Wedding night violence was particularly common and particularly brutal. Many new husbands saw their wedding night as an opportunity to establish dominance and control from the very beginning of the marriage. Historical accounts, often buried in legal proceedings or church records, tell stories of brides who were beaten, raped, and tortured on their wedding nights by men who saw this behavior as their right and duty. The most chilling aspect of these accounts is how normal they were considered. Violence against wives was so accepted that it rarely even warranted comment unless it was extreme enough to cause permanent injury or death. And even then, the legal consequences for husbands were minimal. The systematic oppression of medieval women wasn't just about personal cruelty. It was economically motivated and carefully structured to benefit male-dominated society. Women's bodies and reproductive capacity were seen as economic resources to be controlled and exploited. A bride's dowry, the money or property her family paid to secure her marriage, wasn't a gift to help the young couple start their life together. It was payment to the groom's family for taking on the burden of supporting her. But once married, the husband gained control not just of the dowry, but of any property the woman might inherit in the future. This created a system where women were literally bought and sold, with wedding nights serving as the final transaction. The consummation of marriage wasn't just a personal moment between spouses. It was the legal confirmation that the purchase had been completed and the goods delivered. Many medieval women never saw their own families again after their wedding nights. They were moved to their husband's household, often far from their birthplace, where they lived under the authority of their new husband and his relatives. Cut off from their support networks, they were completely vulnerable to whatever treatment their new family decided to inflict upon them. Perhaps most disturbing of all was how the medieval Catholic Church, which claimed to protect the vulnerable and defend Christian morality, actively participated in and sanctified this system of female oppression. Church doctrine taught that women were inherently sinful, weak, and in need of male guidance. The story of Eve's temptation in the Garden of Eden was used to justify treating all women as potential sources of moral corruption who needed to be strictly controlled. Marriage was presented not as a partnership of equals, but as a necessary institution for containing female sexuality and ensuring male dominance. The Church's marriage ceremony included explicit language about female submission. Brides were required to promise to obey their husbands, while grooms only promised to love and cherish their wives. This wasn't just symbolic, it was a legally binding contract that gave husbands the right to enforce their authority through whatever means they saw fit. Church leaders often counseled new brides to endure whatever suffering their husbands might inflict, teaching that female suffering was actually spiritually beneficial. Pain and submission were portrayed as paths to salvation, making resistance not just legally dangerous, but morally wrong. This religious justification made the systematic abuse of women seem not only acceptable, but actually holy. Wedding night violence wasn't just legally permitted, it was spiritually sanctioned. Despite the overwhelming power of the system arrayed against them, some medieval women did resist. But their stories of rebellion often ended in tragedy, serving as warnings to other women about the consequences of defying male authority. Legal records contain scattered accounts of women who fought back against abusive husbands, but the punishments for such resistance were severe. A woman who struck her husband could be publicly whipped, placed in stocks, or even executed depending on local laws. The same act that might earn a husband praise for correcting his wife could cost a woman her life if she dared to defend herself. Some women attempted to flee abusive marriages, but medieval law gave husbands the right to hunt down and forcibly return runaway wives. Professional wife hunters existed in some regions, men who specialized in tracking down and capturing women who had escaped their marriages. The punishments for captured runaway wives were designed to be so severe that other women would never dare attempt escape. Perhaps most tragically, some young brides took their own lives rather than face what they knew was coming. Suicide among newly married women was common enough that some medieval legal codes specifically addressed the problem, though typically by punishing the woman's family rather than examining the conditions that drove her to such desperation. The systematic oppression that characterized medieval marriage didn't disappear when the Middle Ages ended. Many of these attitudes and practices persisted for centuries, evolving and adapting, but never truly disappearing. The legal concept that a husband could not rape his wife, because she was his property and had consented to all future sexual acts through marriage, remained part of legal systems well into the modern era. Marital rape wasn't recognized as a crime in all 50 U.S. states until 1993, and it remains legal in many countries around the world today. The idea that women are naturally suited for submission and domestic service, that their primary value lies in their reproductive capacity, and that male violence against women is sometimes justified, these medieval attitudes echo through centuries of law, literature, and social custom right up to the present day. The legend of Jus Primae Noctis has captured our imagination because it represents a clear, dramatic symbol of male oppression that we can easily condemn and distance ourselves from. It's a convenient horror story that makes us feel superior to our medieval ancestors. But the reality of medieval women's lives was far more complex and in many ways more disturbing than any legend. The systematic, legal, religiously sanctioned oppression that characterized their daily existence was not the product of a few evil lords claiming sexual privileges. It was the result of an entire civilization built on the principle that women were property to be owned, controlled, and exploited. These women lived and died in a world where their wedding nights often marked not the beginning of adult life and companionship, but the end of whatever small freedoms they might have enjoyed as daughters. They entered marriages knowing they might face violence, forced pregnancy, economic exploitation, and social isolation, with no legal recourse and little hope of escape. Their suffering was not legendary. It was daily, systematic, and largely invisible to the historical record because it was so completely normal that few people bothered to document it. The next time you hear someone romanticize the medieval period or suggest we should return to traditional marriage values, remember these forgotten brides. Remember their fear, their pain, and their powerlessness. Remember that the good old days were built on the systematic oppression of half the human population. Their stories deserve to be told not because they're shocking, but because they're true. And truth, however dark, is always more important than comforting legends. In the shadows of history, countless medieval women faced their wedding nights with terror rather than joy. We owe it to their memory to acknowledge not just the legends that have grown up around their suffering, but the real, documented, systematic oppression that defined their lives. The darkness of the medieval world wasn't just about crude customs or primitive medical knowledge. It was about a civilization that looked at half of humanity and decided they were worth less than livestock. That's a horror no legend could ever capture, and a truth we must never forget. The year is 1455, England. As autumn's cold winds beat against the stone walls of Bletsoe Castle, a 12-year-old little girl receives news that will change her destiny. Her name is Margaret Beaufort. And today, we're going to tell a true, painful story that reveals the real face of medieval marriages. This story is not just a legend. It's a real-life story, proven by historical documents. And unfortunately, it's just one example of the tragedy experienced by thousands of young girls during that era. Margaret Beaufort was betrothed to John de la Pole by her guardian when she was 6 years old, but 3 years later she was re-betrothed to her stepbrother Edmund Tudor by order of King Henry VI. The first 12 years of her life passed like a chess piece, constantly changing hands. Margaret's story begins in the Beaufort dynasty, one of medieval England's most powerful families. Her father, John Beaufort, is the Duke of Somerset, and dies when Margaret is only 1 year old. This little girl becomes a valuable commodity for political marriages due to the noble title and land inheritance she receives from her father. At age 7, the age of reason according to medieval law, Margaret's fate is now in the hands of others. Age 7 is considered the age of reason, and after this age, breaking an engagement becomes more difficult. And Margaret, at an age when she should still be playing with toys, is placed at the center of marriage negotiations. On November 1st, 1455, Margaret's marriage to Edmund Tudor took place. She was 12 years old, while her husband was 24. Think about it. A child who would be in elementary school by today's standards is being married to a man exactly 12 years older. Edmund Tudor is not only Margaret's guardian, but will also be her husband. This dual role shows how misogynistic medieval law was. A man first manages a girl child's financial affairs, then marries her to himself and controls the rest of her life. The wedding night must have been a complete nightmare for Margaret. At 12 years old, a child who was not yet physically mature became the legal property of a man twice her age. At 12, Margaret was considered old enough to enter into a marriage contract and married her guardian, Edmund. Although technically old enough to marry, it was unusual for such a young bride to have sexual relations with her husband. But unfortunately, in Margaret's case, this unusual situation occurred. The following spring, Margaret was pregnant. Yes, you heard that right. Margaret, who married at 12, was pregnant at 13. By today's standards, this is horrific child abuse, but it was considered normal at the time. In the middle of her pregnancy, fate was preparing another blow for Margaret. Edmund Tudor was captured while fighting on the Lancastrian side in the Wars of the Roses, and Edmund, being a Lancastrian, did not live to see his child by Margaret, as he was later captured and died soon after. Widowed at 13, Margaret was 7 months pregnant and far from her mother in Bedfordshire. Think about it. 13 years old in a foreign place, widowed while pregnant. Margaret, still a child herself, had to both mourn and prepare for childbirth. In January 1457, Margaret's labor pains began at Pembroke Castle. At 13 years old, a child whose body was not yet ready for childbirth was experiencing one of the most critical moments of her life. The risk of death during childbirth was very high at that time, especially for young girls like Margaret. Young mothers whose bodies were not yet fully developed often lost their lives during childbirth. Margaret was aware of these terrible statistics. After hours of agonizing labor, Margaret's son was born. His name would be Henry Tudor, the child who would ascend to the English throne as Henry VII in the future. But for Margaret, this birth was not a triumph, but a traumatic experience. The birth was so difficult that Margaret could never get pregnant again. This trauma she experienced at 13 never gave her another chance to be a mother. Throughout her entire life, Henry would be her only child. Margaret's ordeal did not end after childbirth. She was separated from her young son, who remained in Wales under the guardianship of Jasper Tudor. According to medieval law, Margaret was not yet of age, and custody of her son passed to his father's family. Thus, Margaret lost not only her husband, but also her son. At 13, she was both widowed and separated from her child. Her maternal instincts were ignored in the face of social rules. This situation deeply affected Margaret. She spent the rest of her life struggling to reunite with her son. She made political marriages, engaged in intrigues, even plotted for the throne, all to make her son Henry the King of England. At 14, Margaret was betrothed to Sir Henry Stafford, son of Humphrey Stafford, 1st Duke of Buckingham. They married on January 3, 1458, for security reasons. Her second marriage went better, but Margaret's heart always remained with her son. Margaret's story ruthlessly shows how powerless medieval women were. From the moment she was born as a girl child, her body, inheritance, and future were controlled by others. She was betrothed at 6, married at 12, made a mother at 13, and separated from her son at 13. But Margaret, unlike many medieval women, had a strong character. Despite all the trauma she experienced, she tried to secure her son's future using her political intelligence. And in the end, she succeeded. Henry Tudor became King of England and founded the Tudor dynasty. Margaret Beaufort's story shows the real face of medieval marriages. This is not the story of romantic fairy tales, but of child abuse, forced marriage, and systematic oppression. Margaret was lucky. She had a powerful family, survived, and eventually gained some power. But thousands of young girls like her suffered silently and died without leaving a trace in the pages of history. When we think of the romantic marriage traditions of the Middle Ages, let's remember girls like Margaret. This little girl who was forcibly married at 12, made a mother at 13, and separated from her child. Because history is not just the story of kings and knights, but also of these forgotten child brides. And their pain is more real and tragic than any legend. Margaret Beaufort's story reveals a reality far more horrific than the legend of first-night rights in the Middle Ages, an era when systematic child abuse was protected by law, when children were bought and sold like goods. We must not forget this reality, because only by accepting the painful truths of the past can we understand the value of today.